Science is interesting, and if you don't agree, you can fuck off.
Welcome to the Darwin Digest, episode 47. This week, we continue our journey through the human races, and we are covering the Far East. I am joined, as per usual, by my co-hosts Lawrence Drake.
Hello.
And Kathy Princess.
Hello.
Alright, so we've got a few different topics this week, stretching from actually quite a narrow range, from Japan to China. We didn't actually decide on who to go first, so I don't know. Kathy, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, yeah, no problem. I'm going to talk about the Uyghurs. So they are the sort of Western Turkic tribes that live in China, modern-day China, and they're the ones that claim to be the descendants of the Tocharians and the Tarim Basin. And we did talk about the Tocharians a little bit in one of our Q&A shows, the red-headed mummies of China. So I thought it would be kind of interesting to cover the people who live there currently, and maybe try and sort of unpick if there's a connection between the two. So the Uyghurs primarily live in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in China, where they are one of 55 ethnic minorities. So it's very vibrant and diverse down there. And they are possibly the shittiest people in China because they practice Islam. So obviously that is that's always an added extra problem, on top of any kind of ethnic idiosyncrasies. And they are a physically diverse ethnic group. So they basically, if you Google image search, Uyghurs, you can find anybody who looks pretty much almost sort of Hapa looking or Quapa looking, kind of really white looking people, blonde hair, blue eyes, with maybe like the funny, Far Eastern eyes, up to proper Chinese looking moon faces. So yeah, basically a huge range of phenotypes over there. So at least 80% of Xinjiang's Uyghurs live in the Tarim Basin that I just mentioned previously, and outside of Xinjiang there's a large community in Hunan, which is I don't really know why you can Google that. Somewhere in China. Outside of China, there's also diasporas in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, all the other stans, and Turkey. So the name Uyghur, the meaning of the term is unclear. There are old Turkic inscriptions that record a similar word. And the modern kind of etymological explanations range all the way from to follow, accommodate oneself, and non-rebellious, all the way to wake, rouse, stir. But none of them really can quite grasp the sort of linguistic concept of this term. So the earliest records of a Uyghur tribe is from the Northern Wei, so that's 300 to 500 AD. And the first use of Uyghur as a reference to a political entity occurred during the interim period between the first and second Göktürk Khaganates, which is in the 600 AD. So yeah, that kind of sounded like a place from the Göktürk Khaganate. Sounds like a place from Warcraft, but there we go. The term Uyghur disappeared from historical records in the 15th century, but actually the Bolsheviks reintroduced the term to replace the previously used Turk or Turkey. And in modern usage, it refers to the settled Turkic urban dwellers and farmers of the Tarim Basin who follow traditional Central Asian sedentary practices, and which means they are distinguishable from the nomadic Turkic populations in Central Asia. So modern Uyghurs are considered to be descendants of a number of people, including the ancient Uyghurs of Mongolia, who arrived at the Tarim Basin after the fall of the Uyghur Khanate. Also, Iranic Sakha tribes and other Indo-European peoples who inhabited the Tarim Basin before the arrival of the Turkic Uyghurs. And DNA analysis indicate that the people of Central Asia are all kind of mixed Caucasian and East Asians. So yeah, basically kind of the Hapas of the world. Uyghur activists identify themselves with the Tarim mummies. I don't know, Uyghurs, Gingers, which we have discussed previously, but the actual research into the genetic Tarim mummies and the links to modern Uyghurs is a little bit controversial, and I'll go into the genetics in a little bit. So the origin of the modern ethnic concept is this is from Owen Lattimore's book. Article, Return to China's Northern Frontier. So, quote, the Uyghurs are the people whom old Russian travelers called Sart, which is a name that they use for sedentary Turkish-speaking Central Asians in general, while foreign travelers call them Turkey in recognition of their language. The Chinese used to call them Chantou, I did not pronounce that right, I'm sure, which means turban heads, but this term has been dropped, being considered derogatory. And the Chinese, using their own pronunciation, now call them Weiwei. As a matter of fact, there was for centuries no national name for them. People identify themselves with the oases they came from, like Kashgar or Turfan. So that's pretty much the kind of etymology of the term and you know the general historical origins of the group. So the history of the history of the region and the people is apparently a matter of contention between kind of Uyghur ethno-nationalists and the Chinese authority, because the Uyghurs view themselves as the original inhabitants of Xinjiang with a long history, and there's books written that stress the Turkic aspects of his people and that the Turks have a 9,000-year history. Whereas others sort of incorporate the Tarim mummies to conclude that they have 6,500 years of history. But the Chinese view asserts that the Uyghurs in Xinjiang originated from the Tiele tribes and only became the main social and political force in Xinjiang during the 9th century, when they migrated to Xinjiang from Mongolia after the collapse of the Uyghur Khaganate, as mentioned, which replaced the Han Chinese that they claim were there since the Han Dynasty. So this it's a little bit of a political, I guess, issue, because obviously if the people claim an origin there before the Han Chinese, then they're more likely to want an independent state and have a stronger kind of identification with that particular region. So there's that. Now, so let's kind of maybe a little bit about the early history of that part of the region. Now, the Tarim mummies indicate a migration of Indo-Europeans into the Tarim area around 2000 BC. And these people, as we kind of discussed in previous shows, probably spoke the Tocharian languages and were suggested to be by some to be the Yuezhi mentioned in ancient Chinese texts. However, again, Gingers, Uyghur activists claim these mummies to be of Uyghur origin, based partly on a word which they argue to be Uyghur, found in written scripts associated with these mummies, although other linguists suggest it to be a Sogdian word later absorbed into Uyghur, the language. Later migrations, there were peoples from the west and northwest to the Xinjiang region, probably speakers of various Iranian languages, such as the Sakha tribes. Other people in the region mentioned in ancient Chinese texts also include the Dingling as well as the Xiongnu, and also some Uyghur nationalists also claim descent from the Xiongnu, but the view is obviously contested by the Chinese. It's a real kind of a melting pot in the actual sense of the term. All sorts of tribes kind of went there and had their own kind of areas, and then maybe sort of where this kind of melding of these people really come from. So I mentioned the Uyghur Khaganate, so I'll talk a little bit about that. So this Uyghur Khaganate were part of a Turkish confederation called the Tiele, who lived in the valleys south of Lake Baikal and around the Yenisei River. So that's kind of the sort of South Siberia, in geographical terms for people. And it's stretched from it kind of its power stretched from the Caspian Sea to Manchuria and lasted from 744 to 840. It was administered from the imperial capital Ordubalik, one of the biggest ancient cities built in Mongolia. And in 840, following a famine and civil war, the Uyghur Khaganate was overrun by the Yenisei Kyrgyz and other Turkic people. So the result, the tribal groups formed under Uyghur control dispersed and moved out of Mongolia. And then there were a few kingdoms founded after the fall of the Khaganate, sort of within that region. So the final Khaganate was destroyed in the 1300s by the Mongol Genghis Khan and his family led excursions. So I mentioned that these people are Islamic. So how did that happen? Well, in the 10th century, the Karluks, Yagmas, and other Turkic tribes founded the Kara Khanid Khanate. Oh, that's a mouthful. So these then ruled over the Uyghurs at the time, and these people converted to Islam in the 10th century, and the sort of Islamization was a gradual process, including kind of forced conversions, conquerings, and voluntary conversions as well. So, for example, there was a Indo-European Sakha Buddhist kingdom in the region as well that was conquered and slowly converted into Islam, for example. And the process was only completed during the 17th century, so it took a while for it to happen. Okay, so that's that, I think, for the kind of a brief view into the history. So I'm going to talk a little bit about genetics. Do you guys want to comment on anything about the history before I go on?
It just seems baby not happy, but he obviously does not like the white Chinese. It's the overall theme that I got, and this is it sounds shitposty, but the idea that I sort of got from it is sort of it sounds kind of like impotent manlet rage, where they're constantly beating their hands against. There's always a bigger empire they're constantly beating their hands against and just never succeeding, which is, I guess that would actually be most countries, a description of most countries, but it's. Maybe it was, when we do this sort of show, you pick the interesting parts, and it might have just been selection bias, but it does seem that it does sound like they're more offended by their lack of nobility than most other cultures that I've read about. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's like you said, it's a tragedy of all small nations, and especially ones that don't have their own state. They really have something to prove about we was kings and that. So yeah, it does kind of come off a little bit like that, and they are problematic in China. I mean, Chinese have even banned Islamic names in that region. Basically, they're doing all they can to not have this belligerent Muslim population, causing problems within the country. So and there's a lot of them over down in Syria fighting with ISIS and that. So they are, like I said, a relatively shitty people, and it's probably more due to Islam than anything else, I think.
Yeah, wherever Islam butts up against another civilization, there's usually bloodshed. And although there are better and worse populations that are Muslim, Usually when you think Islamic terrorism, you think more sort of Arab Islamic terrorism. But yeah, there are terrorist organisations that are Uyghur that have let off bombs and things in mainland China. I can see from some of the pictures, especially on the Wikipedia page, the young Tocharian Uyghur girl. That's going to be a lefty gotcha, as this person white ha got you.
No, is the answer.
Yeah, that's like a few people have sort of brought up like the idea. Recently it's sort of become more and more popular. The response to that sort of deconstructionist argument is just to tell them to go fuck themselves, basically. And yeah, that's it's not something like, is X white? It's a stupid question in general. It's an interesting academic question for inside of our circles, but outside of that, it's stupid.
Exactly. Okay, so that kind of leads us well into the genetics. So as I mentioned, and as Lawrence mentioned as well, there's a huge diversity of phenotypes within the Uyghurs because they are a Eurasian population and they've got Eastern and Western Eurasian anthropometric and genetic traits. And they are considered to be genetically related to both European and East Asian populations, but there are different studies that show different sizes of each component, and it really depends on what, like, precisely the sample size and which geographical part of the Uyghurs they take. So one study using samples from Hotan only found that Uyghurs have 60% European ancestry and 40% East Asian ancestry. While another study showed 52% European and sort of 48% Asian, and so it showed 52% European in southern Xinjiang and 47% European in northern Xinjiang. So again, it depends. There does seem to be variations within the region as well. Another study which sampled a wider area found only about 30% European component, and a study on mitochondrial DNA found the frequency of West Eurasian haplogroups in Uyghurs to be 42% and East Asian haplogroups to be 57%. A study on Y DNA haplogroups found that the Western Eurasian patrilineal haplogroup is about 65 to 70%, and East Asian about 30 to 35%, which kind of leads to the whole Hapa war bride theory. So you have the it makes sense. You have the maternal line being more Asian, and the father's line being more European, which is a funny talking point, I guess. But there we go. So this admixture could be the result of a continuous gene flow from both types of populations, or could be from a single event during a short period of time. I would think that because of the location of the Uyghurs, which nowadays would appear to be quite isolated, but really in the past it was part of the Silk Road, and it was quite a thriving area in trade and a real kind of had an influx of all sorts of people. So I would think that it was probably more of a continuous gene flow situation. So yeah, that is the that's the genetics part of it. They are the quintessential Hapa peoples, I think. And they do seem to have, reading a little bit about their culture, they do seem to have like quite a well established, quite well developed, literature and music and art and stuff. So they're not what I would consider to be primitive. They do seem to have their own civilization. That's quite a unique blend of the historical circumstances where they are. So there we go. That's the Uyghurs in a nutshell. So any questions, comments?
They don't appear to be that much. I mean, there is actually a spread in IQ in China, but the Uyghurs, according to Richard Lin, Uyghur heavy areas aren't really that much lower in IQ. There's in Xinjiang, which is 45% Uyghur, the average IQ is 103.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense if you consider them to be an averaging out of the European and Chinese IQ, then 103 is actually pretty bang on. So,
What did you say the matrilineal haplogroup was?
It's a range of different East Asian haplogroups, more so. So it's about 70% East Asian and 30% sort of West Eurasian. Whereas it's kind of the other way around with the paternal haplogroups.
Okay. Because it's really interesting that you picked such a diverse group ethnically, because I'm covering the Ainu, which are a very, very... they're not inbred, but they are very... that there is no outside race mixing. Anyway, I guess we should probably wrap up your part then, Kathy.
Yep.
Unless you've got any final comments.
No, that's about it.
All right, I guess we'll go from west to east. And Lawrence, do you want to kick us off with the Han?
Yeah, I will. Well, Chinese civilization has written records going back 4,000 years. Now, I'm certainly not going to compress all of that into one talk because that would be extremely boring. So what I'm going to do instead is just talk about things that are interesting. Well, the Han, as people might be aware, they're the dominant ethnic group of China. So when you think China, you think Han. They're 92% of the population. They're also 97% of Taiwan, 76% of Singapore, large populations in Indonesia, where they're about 1.2%. Of course, you've got immigrant populations in places like Australia, 860,000, 400,000 in the UK, 150,000 in Brazil, and there's even 30,000 in Jamaica, so they get around. And why the hell would you want to live in Jamaica? It's an extremely dangerous, violent place. But anyway, they'll go there and they'll set up businesses and do various things. Yeah, in places like Indonesia, you've got a lot of sort of ethnic tension where the Chinese, who have higher IQs than the Indonesians, they do better at business and they become successful, and the locals resent that, and then they occasionally riots break out and they burn their shops and things like that. But they are actually the largest ethnic group in the entire world. There's 1.3 billion of them, and that means that 1 in 5 people alive right now are Han Chinese. Now, the origin of the Han, according to historical documents, goes back to the... Now, I'm probably going to butcher some of these names. Huaxia ethnic group, which formed during the Shang and Zhou dynasties between the 21st and 8th centuries BC. So extremely, extremely old. During the Han dynasty, which was 260 AD to 220 AD, the Huaxia developed into a tribe known as the Han, which migrated north with the help of advanced agriculture and technology, and they dispersed across China, becoming the largest of the 56 recognized ethnic groups. Now, genetically...
You're a funny guy, Lawrence.
That's a very interesting comment. That's pretty controversial stuff. I don't know if I can really agree with that. Genetically, the Han can be divided into northern and southern. And the consensus amongst scientists is that the Han migrated south and greatly contributed to the southern Han paternal gene pool, whereas the Han Chinese and ancient southern ethnic groups both contributed equally to the southern Han maternal gene pool. Now, the northern Han had a demographic advantage over the ancient northern ethnic groups, thanks to the Han skill in agriculture, technology, and culture, whereas the northern groups were more sort of nomadic. So as you can probably expect, they eventually supplanted and replaced these ancient ethnic groups. Now, here's something highly interesting. In 2004, a paper published in Science, and Science is pretty much the gold standard of scientific journals, Science and Nature, the sort of journals most researchers would spend their entire careers trying to get published in. So this is very good, very solid science going on here. In 2004, there was a paper published which looked at the psychological differences between the northern and southern Chinese. Now, it's known that Asians are more collectivist and the West are more individualistic. But psychologists found that the northern Chinese test higher in cognitive measures of individualism than the southern Chinese. The northern Chinese grew wheat and the southern Chinese grew rice. Of course, they both grew both of them, but the southern was more slanted towards rice, the north more towards wheat. Now, after eliminating
slanted.
Yeah, after eliminating confounding variables like climate and other things, the researchers proposed that the societal patterns involved with farming rice makes cultures more interdependent than farming wheat, and that these patterns continue to affect people into the modern world. The explanation for that is that rice requires elaborate irrigation systems that require cooperation and coordination between people. And these networks have a high labour demand and require the mobility of entire villages rather than just individuals. Now, growing paddy rice requires about twice as much labour as growing wheat. And so labour exchanges developed that rewarded tight relationships and reciprocity. Wheat is much less demanding. It doesn't need to be irrigated, it can be watered with rainfall. So that means one family, or even if it came down to it, one individual can grow an entire crop of wheat by himself. The researchers proposed that this rice culture is passed on so that people who no longer grow rice, so even in a modern post-agricultural environment, they benefit from that cultural inheritance. So could rice culture select for a genetic package of psychological traits? Could it explain, at least in part, the 5-point IQ gap between whites and East Asians? The authors don't directly deal with gene selection or IQ. They're talking entirely about culture, but they do imply it, a sort of genetic cultural coevolution, when they talk about how these traits survived into the post-agricultural and urban society. So, to quote from the paper, perhaps the parts of culture and thought style we measured are more resistant to change, or perhaps modernisation simply takes more generations to change cultural interdependence and thought style. However, most of our participants were born after China's reform and opening, which started in 1978. Furthermore, Japan, South Korea and Hong Kong modernised much earlier than China, but they are still score less individualistic on international studies of culture than their wealth would predict. So that's a quote from the paper. And I think it's plausible that, just as we say that agriculture required a longer time horizon, lower time preference compared to hunter-gatherer societies in sub-Saharan Africa, which accounts for the greater IQ of more northern populations like Europeans compared to southern populations. Just as that's plausible, it could also be plausible that the more intense in terms of intelligence, social cooperation of rice farming selects for a package of genetic traits over wheat farming. I find that plausible.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So, that's just a bit on that. I'll do a bit of history, but so if there's any comments on that stuff, now's a good time for it.
The idea that just the burden required, that there was a problem that needed to be solved, where an ecological niche appears, things will evolve to sort of fit in it, and it's the same idea with intelligence, and you see the exact same thing happen in Europe as well, not just with intelligence, but also measures of like sociability, how it changes the further north that you go. The further north that you go, the more direct emphasis that there is on family or village units working together and cooperating, and you see that even throughout the literature, like as in literature writings through like the medieval period, like what changes as you go further north. There's this, like I said, there's more and more reliance on family and those immediately around you, and then from there is also like the whole idea of I just spent a couple of hours talking about on Kulturkampf, like the Norse guest right. Like there are, this whole idea that you always the emphasis on like cooperation, all of that changes the further north that you go, and that's kind of the same idea as the heavier burden of winter. The further north that you go is the same sort of thing as having to develop more internal cooperation and problem solving that you have with the irrigation required to farm rice. It's kind of the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an issue of trust. I mean, there are high trust and there are low trust cultures. And low trust cultures, they're not sort of anti-family. They're very tight-knit in terms of their family. The problem with them is they don't trust anyone outside of their family. Outside the clan, you're a stranger, you're suspicious, and they don't want anything to do with you. And that hampers their ability to build these high trust institutions that Europeans have built.
Yeah, pretty much. And I think Kathy has disappeared to deal with her child.
I'm here.
Oh, you're here? Okay.
I'm back. Yeah.
You've just silenced the child.
Not quite. I've made some efforts towards that.
Okay, just slip a little vodka in the bottle, and that should
He's too old
sends
for
him
the
right
bottle.
to sleep.
I thought you were going to say he's too old for vodka.
No, I don't give him the bottle anymore. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. So, I mean, there's nothing really I can add that you guys haven't covered. So I'll let us move on.
Okay, well, the next bit I think is something that people are going to find really interesting and perhaps a little rustling. If you're of the view, there's a white version of we was Kangs. Like whenever another culture does something better than white, some people in our movement, I'm sorry to say, will say, oh, it's fake, it's made up, and white people are the best at everything, and anything that indicates otherwise is fake. And that's the white version of we was Kangs. Now, I'm not into that. I only care about truth, not flattering my own ego. So what I'm going to tell you might be rustling if you believe that white people were the best at everything at every point in history. I'm going to challenge that view. A case could be made that during the Middle Ages, Chinese civilization was superior to European civilization. I'm going to make that case to you right now. In 1500, Beijing was the largest city in the world, with 600,000 inhabitants. Paris, conversely, was 200,000. London, 50,000. Ming Dynasty China in the 1400s was pretty much the global superpower. Construction on the Forbidden City started in 1406. Well, it went from 1406 to 1420 and took over 1 million labourers. Even as late as 1776, Adam Smith called China, quote, one of the richest, that is, most fertile, best cultivated, most industrious, and most populous countries in the world. And he also said, quote, a much richer country than any part of Europe. In 1420, the Yangtze River was a vast waterway complex linking Nanjing with Beijing. Emperor Yong'ul improved upon it with a system of dams and redirection of the water, and when he had finished, it was trafficking 12,000 grain barges a year and employed 50,000 men to maintain. This volume of commercial traffic would have made medieval Venice look quaint, and in fact it was. In fact, the Venetian Marco Polo, who visited China in the 13th century, he wrote that Chinese civilization was superior to European civilization. When he observed the Yangtze, he said, quote, "The multitude of vessels that invest this great river is so great that no one who should read or hear would believe it. The quantity of merchandise carried up and down is past all belief. In fact, it is so big that it seems to be a sea rather than a river." End quote. Nanjing in 1420 was the largest city in the world, and was also the centre of major industries such as silk and cotton. It was also the centre of learning, and Emperor Yongle commissioned an encyclopedia to encompass the entirety of Chinese knowledge. It took 2,000 scholars, and it consisted of 11,000 volumes, and it was the largest encyclopedia in the world up until 2007, when Wikipedia became bigger. The River Thames, by comparison, would have appeared a backwater if a visitor from China was to look at it. The standard of living in Ming China was also higher in the 15th century than it was in Europe. Now, it needs to be remembered that Europe had the Black Death and also epidemics of dysentery and typhus and smallpox. Nevertheless, in the largest Chinese cities, human waste excrement was collected regularly and used as fertiliser in the outlying paddy fields, whereas sanitation in London consisted of taking a shit in a bucket and then throwing it out the window. As you can probably imagine, this sort of putting filth onto the streets was a breeding ground for disease and epidemics. Life expectancy at birth in London between 1540 and the 1800s was 37. Not only that, but the murder rate in 14th century Oxford was 50 per 100,000. Now, to put that into perspective, Detroit at its worst in the 1980s was 45 per 100,000. And medieval Italy and France were even worse. So what would a visitor from China say if he looked at it? He might look at us and say, "You guys are a bunch of dindus, living in filth, dying at 37, and murdering each other all the time." I mean, maybe we also had gangster rap back then, who knows? Night rap or something. Anyway, Asian agriculture was more productive. Rice cultivation was efficient enough that 1 acre could support one family. In England, it was 20 acres to support one family. And this explains to a large extent the much larger population numbers in China. And in terms of technological innovation, China exceeded Europe. The water clock was originally invented by either the Egyptians, Babylonians, or the Chinese. No one knows for certain. However, in 1086, Su Song, an engineer, added a gear escapement and created the world's first mechanical clock. And it was a 40-foot high contraption that not only told the time, it also charted the movements of the sun, moon, and planets. Marco Polo saw one of these in northern China, and no comparable devices had been built in Europe until about a century later. And not only that, the Chinese invented paper in the 11th century. They had paper money, they had toilet paper. They invented the printing press with movable type. They had private banks existing since 1000 AD, and their paper money was backed with a was able to be exchanged for metal reserves. So gold standards for the libertarians out there. The Chinese invented the seed drill, which is a device that ensures that seeds are planted at regular intervals and puts them deeper into the ground so that birds don't come along and eat them. That was invented 2,000 years before the Englishman Jethro Tull pioneered its use in 1701. The first blast furnace for smelting iron was invented in 200 BC in China. They also had the first iron suspension bridge in the 1st century AD. Production of iron in China exceeded production in London up until 1788. The Chinese revolutionised textile production with the spinning wheel and silk reeling frame, which were imported into Italy in the 13th century. A lot of people know about gunpowder. That was a big one. Jiao Yu and Li Ji's 14th century treatise describes land and sea mines, rockets, and explosive cannonballs. Other inventions include chemical insecticide, the fishing reel, matches, the magnetic compass, playing cards, the toothbrush, and the wheelbarrow. They also had a game called Qiuan that was similar to golf. It was played with a set of clubs of some were metal, some were wood, and that predates golf that was invented in Scotland. Now, in contrast to Europe, which was racked with internal conflicts and wars, with power divided between a myriad of competing kings, nobles, and the clergy, which actually was a point in its favour, which I could talk about later on, China was run by a top-down, by a Confucian bureaucracy. And to enter into the civil service, applicants had to sit a 3-stage examination, which took place in vast complexes of these little rooms, which were only big enough for a bench, a seat, and a bucket to do your business in. And the exam lasted for 3 days straight. And they were watched by soldiers in lookout towers. And they would have servants to come along and replenish the rooms with food and water and remove the waste bucket. Now, this was pretty intense. Some candidates were driven insane by sitting in a room for 3 days doing an exam with thousands of other people competing against you. Only the most driven and competitive would pass, but the content emphasised rote memory and conformity to Confucian classics. So bold, innovative thinking was not emphasised. You definitely had to be cautious in your exegesis of these texts. Now, not only that was the internal story, but what about internationally? In the 1400s, China was poised to become a global superpower. Maybe it could even be considered a global superpower. The treasure ship of the Admiral Zheng He was 5 times as large as Columbus's Santa Maria, and it was part of a fleet of 300 ships, all of which were bigger than anything produced in the 15th century in Europe. And it held a crew of 28,000. And his navy was bigger than anything in the West up until World War I. Now compare that with Christopher Columbus and his rinky-dink fleet. I think it was like 200 people and 5 ships or something. This fleet went on 6 voyages between 1405 and 1424, and it sailed to Thailand, to Sumatra, to Java, India, Temasek, which is modern-day Singapore, Malacca, Ceylon, Jeddah, which is in modern-day Saudi Arabia. And unlike Western voyages, it wasn't really about trade. He was instructed by the emperor to purchase various items like precious stones and rugs, ceramics, but the voyage was not primarily about trade. Unlike Europeans, they explored the world to make money. And, there's a reason why Europe sort of won out over China. Zheng's voyages were displays of power. What he did was he sailed to these far-flung places and he went up to the rulers and gave them presents and things in order to demonstrate the power and opulence of Chinese civilization. And then he demanded tribute and an acknowledgement of China's supremacy. In one of his voyages, he sailed to East Africa and he invited 30 African rulers aboard his ship, and the Sultan of Malindi, which is in modern-day Kenya, lavished him with gifts, including a giraffe. And the giraffe was presented to Emperor Yong'ul at the Imperial Palace in Nanjing, where it was hailed as a mythical unicorn and a symbol of, quote, perfect virtue, perfect government, and perfect harmony in the empire and universe. So, Ming Dynasty China seemed to have everything going for it. Had a superior navy, superior technology, living standards were better, industrial output was higher, they were primed for an industrial revolution, and if they wanted to, they could have circumnavigated the globe. But in 1424, Yongle died, and China started to stagnate. Yongle's voyages were suspended, and voyages was actually banned by the government. In 1500, there was the death penalty for building a ship more than 2 masts. And the records of Zheng He's voyages were all burned. And to this day, nobody knows why China did this and started to turn inwards. Various things have been floated as possibilities: financial problems, political rivalry, war, in Annam, which is modern-day Vietnam, and that war was running up a pretty high cost. Or maybe it was the Confucian suspicion of foreign and odd things. Nobody's entirely sure. But when Ming Dynasty collapsed, the empire split up into warring factions, and disease and epidemics became rife. And it all went to shit then. And, from then on, it was really the emergence and age of Europe, and Europe became the dominant power, and no power has dominated the world as Europeans did in the entirety of human history. So, that's it for that section. Questions and comments?
Yes. So, it does seem surprising, like, how they had literally the world at their fingertips, and then it just kind of stopped. It's one of the great mysteries of history is why they did just stop, why they burnt all these ships. Yeah, I mean, thinking about it, I think it kind of illustrates in a way the difference in mindset really between the European and the Chinese, because to us this is completely incomprehensible, but I'm sure to them it made perfect sense, disturbing the balance of the yin and yang or whatever. But I think that's just one way to, just one very kind of poignant illustration of that. So the other thing, I think you kind of talked a little bit about it, the whole industrial output and the inventions and how important they all were. And I don't know, other than really deluded people, I don't think anybody could possibly doubt that. The issue comes in 2 forms. So one issue is the human cost to their inventions, because I think it's no secret that they have a lot less care for human life and suffering, and they're just happy to press gang millions of people into building a wall, and sacrifice countless lives for a particular social or political or scientific experiment. I think that's pretty much clear, and that's something that we just probably don't have the moral backing, the sort of the moral mindset. We don't have that. We aren't really able to do that. So that's one kind of thing I wanted to mention. And the other thing is really, I think so that the Chinese, they were probably really good at inventing something, but then kind of expanding on it, I think is where they kind of fall down, and that's why it took the Western societies, learning of these inventions to really put them to their full potential.
Yeah, I was going to say, the Chinese may have invented black powder, but it was a German who invented smokeless powder.
I think there is a lot of truth in what you guys have just said. They did invent a lot of things. They did not invent, to my knowledge, the scientific method. It was sort of a trial and error thing. Now, they certainly were able to do things, but it took the West to come up with the scientific method in a systematic examination of nature, using certain techniques, laws, and principles to do that. And yes, they did invent gunpowder, but what did the West do once it got its hands on gunpowder? Turned it into an instrument of mass death, and the West was unstoppable when it got gunpowder.
Yeah, maybe they're just really happy that they got a giraffe, and they don't need to go out anymore.
Oh, once you got a giraffe, what else do you need?
Yeah, I know, right? Like I said, it's a symbol of the perfect unity in government, the people, and in heaven.
Can you imagine, like, not knowing what a giraffe was, not being even aware of the concept, and then seeing a giraffe? It would sort of appear to be like someone introducing a unicorn at the zoo or something.
Yeah, it's it's interesting. I get we kind of the same thing when you see like the deep sea fish and stuff like that, like how freaky they get. But even so, they have like a regular-ish form. You know, they're just horrific looking.
Yeah, like the anglerfish and things. They do look like something out of a horror movie, that's for sure.
The whole idea that I think there are very few people who are kind of, it's all, all white people all the time is like, have been the dominant force in the world. But really the thing that matters is, we are Europeans. Like this is mine, it's no one else's. And even if China like never stopped its ascendancy, and they were the ones who went to space hypothetically and all that sort of stuff, I would still be European. I wouldn't want to be Chinese. I want to be my people, a part of my people.
Yeah, that's totally true. Although I'm just touching on something that was said a bit earlier, one thing to keep in mind, and I wouldn't want to go on too long about it because you could do an entire show on why history diverged at that point and the West became the dominant power. But one thing that probably plays into it to some extent is that China was ruled by a singular Confucian bureaucracy, and everything was completely centralized. So when Yongle died, everything went to shit. And whereas in Europe, that division of power and that competition between competing powers was actually an asset. The British became the dominant empire for about 500 years, and what it did is it brought together three things that were going on in Europe. And Europe was competing with each other, wars, fighting, lots of things. Britain brought together its own political institutions, which were much better. Common law, property rights, rule of law, trial by jury, all of these things. Bringing that with Spanish shipbuilding, seamanship, navigation. For a long time, the Spanish Empire appeared to have the world in its hands. And Dutch banking and finance. When you brought all of those things together, it created a superpower. So you could go on for a long time about advantages that Europe had institutionally that China didn't have, but there's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, it's the idea that you constantly have to struggle against something. Like, you've always got something to strive for, and you've always got something to, bang up against. It's a theme in human evolution as well as just in nature in general. The one that has to struggle the most is the one that's in general is going to be the one that's going to win out. Because they wouldn't have survived if they didn't.
Well, could it happen again? Could China become the superpower? It's the second largest economy in the world. It's projected to eclipse American GDP. I can't remember in how long, but at some point in the future it's projected to do that. Notwithstanding, I'm not saying that its future doesn't have problems in it. It's got demographic problems, it has structural problems, it has economic problems. It has problems in that the state still controls about 70% of the economy, and that section of it is pretty inefficient. But you can't say it'll never happen again, because it's happened in the past, and it could undergo... We could end up living in the world in which China is the superpower. Maybe an iPhone will say, or the future version of an iPhone will say, designed in China, manufactured in California. You never know. Maybe we'll be working for them.
Well, if I don't necessarily know about the design idea just because of cultural problems. It's going to take a long time for China to do that, to sort of switch gears in that regard. However, if they ever do, like even during the height of the height of China as an empire, their Confucian ideals still kind of bounded them to rote as opposed to any sort of innovation. But as far as like becoming the largest economy, as long as they're the only real large power that is looking after their own ethnic interests, then yeah, it's going to happen. The moment the United States sort of says, stuff it, we're doing our own thing now, China's not going to be doing anywhere near as well as they have been.
You are entirely correct, and that will be. I think if we set our mind to it, it wouldn't really. We could go back to. Well, I mean, the West is still dominant, no doubt about it, but its future is uncertain because of things like population replacement, mass Muslim and African migration into Europe, into these overburdened and insolvent welfare states. The future is not very certain for Europe. I mean, it's still going pretty strong, but you can't just put your feet back on the table, sit back and say, well, the West is dominant now, it always will be dominant for the foreseeable future. But yeah, China basically looks out for its own interest, and it certainly doesn't say, oh, well, I need to import the entire third world to become more diverse or whatever. It's not saying ridiculous things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Did you have any final thoughts, or perhaps we should move on to my part?
Yeah, I think we should.
All right.
Are you going to talk about ninjas and samurai?
And
Let us talk
samurai.
about glorious Nippon.
I want to hear about ninjas and samurai.
Samurai.
So if you can put a few ninjas, if you can just put a few ninjas in there, that would be good.
All right. Unfortunately, I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about the nips that can grow beards. The Ainu, or the Ainu. The pronunciation actually varies depending on region, from what I can see, because it's it's basically Russian and Japanese. And the Ainu are an ethnic group. Obviously, they inhabited a region stretching from northeastern Honshu, that's the main island of Japan, and Hokkaido, or Hokkaido, however you say it, which is like the little top part of island just at the top of Japan, all the way to the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia. Interestingly, like I mentioned before, they possess almost exclusively haplogroup DM174, which originated in Asia around 60,000 years ago and is shared sporadically amongst a few other groups in Central Asia and China in particular. The distribution of this particular haplogroup is odd because there's no sort of smooth distribution of it. It's all very just densely populated. It's like a densely populated, but only in certain parts, which is odd. We don't particularly have a good explanation for that at the moment. It's kind of like there are ideas, but there's no like definitive answer yet. Anyway, in 1893, anthropologist Arnold Henry Savage Landor, that's an awesome name by the way, described the Ainu as having deep-set eyes and eye shape typical of Europeans, with a large and prominent brow ridge, large ears, hairy and prone to baldness, slightly flattened hook nose with large and broad nostrils, prominent cheekbones, large mouth and thick lips, and a long region from nose to mouth and small chin region. They were that's the end of his description. They were often also described as light brown in complexion, but that was mostly due to time spent fishing and hunting outdoors. They were a hunter-gatherer society. The elderly who stayed indoors due to infirmity were actually quite pale. So the similarity to the European phenotype led many early anthropologists to believe that the Ainu were actually of Caucasian descent. With the advent of haplotype analysis, this is not true. We know this is not true, but it's a really interesting case of what is effectively convergent evolution. They have an IQ of 97, which is really interesting for a hunter-gatherer population. They were actually quite complex. The main Japanese population has an IQ of 105. for perspective. So when I was reading about this group, what I kind of noticed is that they're an example of cultural extinction, and it's like I could see mirrors with where we are heading as a people. So it's a bit worrying. In the 18th century, up until the Meiji Restoration, there were 80,000 of them living in Japanese territory. The Meiji Restoration, which began in 1868, and the resultant annexation of Hokkaido, effectively dissolved the Ainu people and their culture. They went from a relatively isolated group of people to having their land, language, religion, and customs assimilated with those of the Japanese by law in many cases. In addition to this, the land that they lived on was distributed directly to the Waijin, the main Japanese population, who had decided to move to Hokkaido, encouraged by the Japanese government of the Meiji era to take advantage of the island's abundant natural resources and to create and maintain farms in the model of Western industrial architecture, agriculture. The Meiji Reformation, Restoration, for those who don't know, was basically a big shift in Japan towards becoming more Western, to the point where, at a certain point in time, officers were even banned from having swords, which was obviously ended around, I think it was just after the Russo-Japanese War of, was it 1904 to 1905? But yeah, it's like that was what they did. They sent the Japanese sent people all around the world all around the Western world to learn the glories of the West, which is why they have such a high quality alcohol industry. Basically, they copied whiskey and beer production from the West, and they got quite good at it. Anyway, the process was referred to as takushoku, which is essentially just colonization. They had factories, flour mills, and beer breweries, and mining practices. All of these infrastructure created, a lot of roads and railway lines, basically shutting out any of the any real ability to hunt and or gather in the region. And during this time, the Ainu were forced to learn Japanese, required to adopt Japanese names, and ordered to cease religious practices such as animal sacrifice and the custom of tattooing. They tattooed their women around the mouth. It looks kind of weird. There's a picture on Wikipedia of it. The Ainu were distributed from the. This is from actually just straight from Wikipedia that I've taken, because this part is kind of really depressing. And like I said, this is where we're heading. We can have a chat about that after. So anyway, from Wikipedia, the Ainu were distributed in the northern and central islands of Japan, from Sakhalin Island in the north to the Kuril Islands and the island of Hokkaido and northern Honshu. Although some investigators placed their former range throughout Honshu, others placed them as far north as some tip of the Kamchatka Peninsula, that what is now Cape Lopatka, and the island of Hokkaido was known to the Ainu as Ainu Monshia, and it was formally annexed by the Japanese at the date of 1868, partly as a means of preventing intrusions of the Russians. According to the Russian Empire census of 1896, 1,446 persons in the Russian Empire reported Ainu as their mother tongue. 1,434 of them on Sakhalin Island alone. The southern half of Sakhalin was acquired by Japan as the result of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 05, but at the end of World War II in 1945, the Soviets declared war on Japan and took possession of the Kuril Islands and southern Sakhalin. The Ainu population, as previously Japanese subjects, were repatriated to Japan. This repatriation was only ever partially completed. During Tsarist times, the Ainu living in Russia were forbidden from identifying themselves as such. Is same in Imperial Japan. They were prevented from identifying themselves as Ainu because Imperial Japanese officials claimed that all regions inhabited by the Ainu in the past or present belonged to Japan. The term Kuril or Kamchatka or Kurili, etc. were used to identify the ethnic group. During Soviet times, people with Ainu surnames were sent to gulags and labor camps, as they were often mistaken for Japanese. As a result, large numbers of Ainu changed their surnames to Slavic ones. After World War II, most of the Ainu living in Sakhalin were deported to Japan. Of the 1,159 Ainu, only around 100 remained in Russia. Of those who remained, only the elderly were full-blooded. Others were either mixed race or married to ethnic Russians. The last of the Ainu households disappeared in the late 1960s when Yamanaka Kataru killed himself after the death of his wife. The couple was childless. To eradicate Ainu identity, Soviet authorities removed the ethnic group from the list of nationalities which could be mentioned in a Soviet passport. Due to this, children born after 1945 were not able to identify themselves as Ainu. The last known deportation of Ainu to Japan occurred in 1982 when Kizu Namakura, a full-blooded northern Kuru Ainu, was deported to Hokkaido after serving 15 years hard labor in the province of Magadan. His wife, Tamara Timovina, a very Slavic last name, after that, which I cannot pronounce, was of mixed Sakhalin Ainu and Gilyak ancestry. After the arrest of Kizo in 1967, Tamara and her son, Alexei Namakura, were expelled from Kamchatka, Karai, and sent to the island of Sakhalin to live in the city of Tomari. In 1979, the USSR removed the term Ainu from the list of living ethnic groups in Russia, an act by which the government proclaimed that the Ainu as an ethnic group were extinct from its territory. In 2002, the Russian Federation census, no respondents gave the ethnonym Ainu in boxes 7 or 9.2 in the K1 form of the census, although some might still exist. So you can see what's happening here. Only the only Ainu speakers live solely in Japan. They're concentrated primarily in the southern and eastern coasts of the island of Hokkaido. Due to intermarriage with the Japanese and ongoing absorption into the predominant culture, there are no truly Ainu settlements existing in Japan today. Many, quote, authentic Ainu villages advertised in Japan are actually just tourist attractions and, quote, provide an opportunity to see and meet Ainu people. So this ethnicity has literally gone from, gone from being an existent people to being a tourist attraction. And just the idea of, the cultural destruction, removing the ability to participate in your own culture, to have your names, forced miscegenation or not forced miscegenation as much as what's a good word? I'm completely blanking here. Encouraged, heavily encouraged.
Highly encouraged.
Miscegenation, all resulting in just sort of the death of this ethnic group, which really does not exist in any functional way anymore. There are still 25,000 or so of them left, but, they don't have a culture, they don't have their land, they don't have anything, and that's kind of, I drew a lot of comparisons to what's happening in Europe with this. Do you guys have any thoughts?
Yeah, it's a little a microcosm of what could possibly happen.
It certainly sounds a bit spooky in its comparison.
Shitlibs commonly respond to, there's no deliberate attempt to try and destroy, European culture, blah, 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 while sort of promoting the exact same things which led to the destruction of this culture. The USSR was brutal with how they went about it, but, the Japanese were no better.
Yeah, I don't know how a shitlib could say there's no war on Western culture when they're the ones waging it. I mean, that's like shooting someone and saying there's no war against you.
Oh, how'd that bullet get in you? It's a mystery.
Yeah, exactly. Are you finished with Japan?
That pretty much wraps up my bit.
Okay, well, I was just going to say that to kind of tie what you were talking about with what I was talking about, Japan was the first to adopt Western, sort of download the Western operating system, so to speak. And they knew that their civilization was inferior to the West, so what did they do? They copied everything. Like, they copied the way we dressed, they copied our food, they even... There was even a debate in Parliament about whether they should replace their language with English. And they were the first to do it, and they did really well out of it. And in the 1960s, Japan overtook Britain in GDP. Of course, Japan has huge problems now demographically. They've basically been economically stagnant for a long time. So I don't know if their future looks quite as bright as it... You know, like in the 90s, people were saying, oh, well, Japan's going to be the dominant power in the future, but people aren't really saying that anymore. But, I mean, in terms of what they came from to where they are now, it was a huge leap. And, I mean, they copied everything. They even have elements of the Napoleonic Code in their constitution. And, yeah.
I just realized there's actually a very strong similarity between Japan and Liberia.
Yeah.
In that they were both, based purely off actually pretty much the same system. Really, like after the Meiji Restoration, then the blacks in Liberia were basically given a country, like given a U.S. Constitution, where with the word United States of America crossed out and the phrase Liberia sort of inserted in there, and it's just kind of like, I wonder how these two population groups wound up so different.
oh yeah, like how you have those conservatives who say, oh well, the success or failure of a country is entirely due to a piece of paper it wrote in history. And you could sort of show how false that is by comparing Japan with Liberia.
Yeah, I never actually thought of that comparison before. I need to remember that one. The thing that the Japanese were really good at is just replicating what we did. They never really innovated.
They do plenty of innovation now.
Yeah.
Definitely one of the most innovative countries in the world at the moment.
What with the...
But in terms of like...
turning 2D waifus into 3D ones.
Yeah. But no, they did not invent the scientific revolution. They did not invent the industrial revolution. I mean, that was all like a blueprint that was written in Europe, and everyone else basically, you either copied it or you didn't get anywhere. Like, it was the way you had to do things in order to even begin to match the West in terms of its economic, military, and cultural power.
Yeah, I do wonder if Japan will recover because, their main problem is their aging population.
Yeah.
And, I've talked about the beautiful ones analogy, the rat utopia experiment, and how that's like, Japan is kind of the human example of that. Maybe hopefully, like, something will happen in such a way that, their population will drop down a bit, and then they can kickstart things again, have a stable replacement rate, and be a properly functioning society at not rat warren levels of population density.
Yeah, it's something like every Japanese woman would have to have something like 17 children or some ridiculous figure like that in order to get up to a positive replacement birth rate. The aging population's a huge problem for them. Now, in the West, the way that we've dealt with it is just simply import Africa, import the Middle East, import all these high birth rate countries. And of course, that's going to turn out brilliant, as we all know. That's how Europe's dealt with the problem. Japan isn't doing that.
No, they're automating, which is the smart way to go about it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Like, Africans, robots. Africans,
but
robots.
I don't think that you can sort of, on an a prioristic basis, say this is what the birth rate should be. Like, I think it's okay for birth rates to stabilise. I think that they... the thing is, no one really knows what contributes to birth rates and what doesn't. I mean, there's several good ideas on what does, but no one has really clinched it on, X causes Y, so to speak. I think that they do. I think that birth rates do are influenced by sort of economic conditions. I think that as the cost of living goes up, then birth rates will go down. As we one of the things that we do know is that as living standards go up, birth rates go down. So I don't think you can sort of say the birth rate has to be this. The problem is the welfare state, these social security systems. I mean, once you introduce something like that, you kind of do need you need high birth rates to maintain it. They can't exist without it, and so that's one of the reasons why Japan's in major shit. Japan is actually a big GIBSMA country. I mean, you might not think it. You think that when it comes to GIBS, it's like Scandinavia or maybe a sort of socialist country that's big on the GIBS. Japan was one of the first countries to introduce like a welfare state, and of course, Japan being Japan, it worked. It wasn't as deleterious compared to imposing that sort of state on another population, because you got the high IQ, you got the high trust. I mean, socially it's a stigma to be on welfare, and there's very little abuse of the system because they're such a high trust population. And of course that sort of thing doesn't occur in like South America or a Western country that has a high immigrant population. I forgot what I was talking about, but yeah.
Yeah, it's. I don't think.
I'm just doing a bit of rambling at the moment.
That's all good. I don't think Japan's problem is the existence of the welfare state. Like their main problem is, just sheerly because if you think about it, the idea of continually having to increase your birth rate to support like more and more elderly, it's a Ponzi scheme.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And so the better, as sort of a concept, but a better way to sort of deal with the issue of aging populations is to have systems in place so that the current population can deal with that aging population without needing more workers. So things like automation is a fantastic example. Take a job away from manufacturing that can then go into nursing or something like that. It's a very, very simple example. If they can stabilize their birth rate, like they don't need to have like 17 children. I'm not talking stabilizing as having 17 children per mother. Stabilize as in, keep to replacement. So the population has, 2.1 children as an example. Yeah. Then you'll find that naturally the population will decrease over time as, more people die than are born, but the population that population itself can actually still maintain itself across generations. And it probably needs to be, the problem is that you can't just not have any kids for a generation and then start having kids again and deal with too many people that way, because obviously you miss a generation, you no longer exist. So it sort of has to be like a very gradual decrease. Anyway, this is a good point to sort of wrap up on.
I agree, yes.
Okay, cool.
And if we keep talking, it means there's more editing for me to do later, so...
Oh, I'm sorry.
I've got a 1 hour 22 on my clock, and I think that's a good stretch.
Yep, and baby is getting irritated at us for talking
He's
for too
sleepy,
long. So...
You're getting sleepy, that's why.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, okay, so we'll wrap up here then.
Okay.
So this has been the Darwin Digest, episode 47, where we have been discussing the Far East. Join us next week when we discuss the Near East and surrounding bits. Anyway, see you next week.
Bye.